A viral video on social media has drawn attention to an issue many people had never heard about, showing an Australian bee farmer explaining that authorities arrived and wiped out all of his hives without allowing him any say in the matter.
The two guys that have come in, I'm assuming that there will be more.
We've proven that we have no varroa mite in our hives. They don't even test it. In fact, they're here to just destroy it. They come here, they've got their petrol, they're pouring it into our hives. The government doing this. The government doesn't want us to eat, and they're doing this. They're killing all the hives in the mid-north coast, the central coast, all the way from Sydney upwards. They're just blanketing it, and then they're going to start spraying the air. They've already got this stuff ready. They're doing this, and they're doing it to wipe out your pollination.
Recently, a major dispute has emerged in Australia as beekeepers seek financial compensation following the large-scale destruction of their hives by government authorities. The destruction was carried out under emergency biosecurity orders after the detection of the Varroa destructor mite in New South Wales in June of 2022. This parasite, infamous for devastating honeybee populations worldwide, had never before been found in Australia, making its detection a national crisis for agriculture and biosecurity officials. The government quickly launched an eradication campaign that resulted in the destruction of more than 14,000 hives over the course of just 4 months. What began as an effort to protect Australia's agriculture has now turned into a fierce legal and social battle, with beekeepers demanding up to $140 million in compensation for their losses. The government's eradication campaign was drastic and immediate. Officials argued that swift and uncompromising action was the only way to stop the spread of the mite before it gained a permanent foothold. Entire apiaries were destroyed, with beekeepers often receiving little notice or input into the decision. For many, this came as a devastating shock. Social media quickly filled with videos and posts from bee farmers who described their hives being removed or destroyed without their consent. These accounts spread rapidly, sparking outrage and sympathy across Australia and beyond. The growing backlash put immense pressure on authorities, with critics arguing that the measures were heavy-handed, unfair, and financially ruinous for hard-working families who depended on beekeeping for their livelihoods. Initially, the official aim was complete eradication of the mite. The strategy was modelled on previous biosecurity campaigns in which Australia had succeeded in eliminating invasive threats. Yet by late 2023, the government quietly abandoned this eradication policy in favour of a long-term management strategy. Officially, the change was attributed to the realization that eradication was no longer feasible due to the mite's spread. However, many within the beekeeping community remain convinced that the enormous pushback from farmers and the viral attention on social media played a significant role in forcing the government to change its course. The consequences of the eradication program were immediate and severe. Beekeepers not only lost their bees, but also their primary source of income. Honey production, pollination services, and breeding operations were all disrupted, with ripple effects extending into agriculture more broadly. Crops that rely on bee pollination, such as almonds, apples, and cherries, faced uncertainty as beekeepers struggled to recover. The sudden removal of tens of thousands of hives caused long-term damage to an industry that is vital not only for honey, but for the stability of Australia's entire food supply chain. The legal claims now being pursued highlight the magnitude of these losses. Beekeepers argue that the destruction of their hives was carried out without fair consultation, and that the compensation offered was inadequate compared to the value of what was lost. Many beekeepers see the $140 million being sought as not merely about financial restitution, but also about recognition of the hardship imposed upon them by government policies that they believe were flawed from the outset. They insist that their businesses, in some cases built over decades, were dismantled almost overnight, with little regard for the human toll. Underlying this dispute is the broader question of trust between governments and agricultural communities. For many beekeepers, the destruction of their hives has left scars that go beyond economics. The sense of powerlessness, of having their life's work taken from them without choice or recourse, has bred deep resentment. Posts circulating online show farmers openly weeping as their hives were destroyed, while others recorded the barren aftermath where their thriving apiaries once stood. These images resonated widely, fueling public sympathy and anger toward the authorities. At the heart of the controversy lies the dilemma of how to balance biosecurity measures with the rights of individuals. The Varroa mite is undeniably a grave threat, capable of wiping out entire bee colonies if unchecked. Left uncontrolled, it could have had devastating consequences for pollination and agriculture in Australia. Yet the way the government handled the crisis, opting for immediate eradication at all costs, has raised questions about whether less destructive, more collaborative approaches could have been taken. Beekeepers argue that their expertise and willingness to cooperate were overlooked, replaced instead by blanket measures that treated all hives in affected zones as expendable. The shift to a management strategy has further fueled frustration. By abandoning eradication after destroying thousands of hives, the government has inadvertently admitted that the sacrifices made by farmers may have been in vain. Beekeepers now find themselves not only without their hives, but also faced with the reality that the mite remains in Australia, spreading despite the destruction. This has deepened the sense of betrayal among those who feel that their losses achieved little more than buying time. The call for compensation is, therefore, not just about financial recovery, but also about accountability. Beekeepers want the government to acknowledge that the eradication campaign was both flawed and damaging. They believe that fair compensation is the least that can be done to repair the immense damage inflicted on their industry and their lives. For some, however, no amount of money will truly make up for what was lost. Generations of breeding programs, carefully developed apiaries and family businesses have been dismantled in the space of months. This dispute has also underscored the vital importance of bees to the wider ecosystem and food economy. Australia's reliance on pollination is immense, with billions of dollars worth of crops depending on healthy bee populations. The destruction of hives has not only impacted individual beekeepers, but has sent shockwaves through the agricultural sector. Farmers who rely on pollination contracts face uncertainty about whether sufficient hives will be available in coming seasons. Consumers, too, may feel the effects, as reduced honey production and pollination could lead to higher prices and diminished availability of certain crops. As the legal process unfolds, the case is drawing international attention. The balance between protecting agriculture and respecting the rights of farmers is a delicate one, and the outcome of this dispute could shape how governments respond to similar crises in the future. For now, the beekeepers remain resolute. Their demand for $140 million reflects not only the economic scale of their losses, but also their determination to hold the government accountable. Many see themselves as guardians of an ancient and essential craft, one that sustains life far beyond the borders of their farms. The fight for compensation is, in their eyes, a fight for fairness, justice, and recognition of the sacrifices they were forced to make. On October 1, 2024, a new law was enacted that requires all individuals keeping poultry or other captive birds to register their flocks immediately if they had not already done so. This law was introduced to strengthen biosecurity measures and improve the UK's response to potential outbreaks of avian diseases. However, not everyone is happy with this news. It carries serious implications for farmers, hobbyists, and anyone involved in poultry or bird keeping in the UK, marking a pivotal moment in the country's management of animal health and agriculture. While the new UK law, requiring the immediate registration of all poultry and captive birds, has been introduced with the goal of enhancing biosecurity and preventing the spread of avian diseases, it has not been universally well received. A vocal segment of bird keepers, particularly those who have chosen to live sustainably or off-grid, are expressing their frustration and concerns about what they see as government overreach into their way of life. These individuals, who often rely on raising their own poultry for eggs, meat, and other resources as part of a self-sustaining lifestyle, argue that the new regulations are an unnecessary intrusion into their private lives and a deliberate attempt to discourage sustainable living. For many sustainable and off-grid livers, self-sufficiency is not just a lifestyle choice, it is a deeply held philosophy centered on independence, environmental stewardship, and resilience. They view raising poultry and other birds as a crucial element of their efforts to reduce their reliance on external systems like supermarkets and industrial food production. These bird keepers see the new requirement to register their flocks with the government as an infringement on their personal freedom and a bureaucratic step that goes against the very principles of autonomy and sustainability that they have built their lives around. One of the primary complaints from sustainable livers is that the law introduces an additional layer of government control over what they consider to be a private and self-sustaining activity. Many feel that registering their birds is the first step toward increased regulation and monitoring of their way of life, fearing that the government may eventually impose further restrictions or mandates that interfere with their ability to live independently. Some bird keepers have voiced concerns that registering their flocks could lead to forced compliance with future regulations, such as mandatory vaccinations or even culling, in the event of an avian influenza outbreak, regardless of the size or isolation of their flocks. For those who value privacy and self-sufficiency, the idea of handing over personal information about their lifestyle choices, such as the number and location of birds they keep, feels like an unnecessary intrusion. Some argue that small-scale bird keepers, especially those in rural or remote areas, should be exempt from such regulations, as their flocks pose little to no threat to national biosecurity compared to large industrial poultry farms. A common theme among those protesting the new law is the belief that government regulations are gradually encroaching on personal freedoms, particularly when it comes to sustainable living practices. Many sustainable livers argue that this law is just one more example of bureaucratic overreach, which threatens to erode their ability to manage their own food production without state interference. They point out that while the law is ostensibly about controlling disease outbreaks, it unfairly targets small-scale hobbyist bird keepers, people who often raise their birds under natural, healthy conditions compared to large industrial farms, which tend to operate under far more intensive and confined conditions. One farmer said that this law is a slippery slope, saying that first they make farmers and families register their birds, next they'll be telling owners how to raise them, and before you know it, they'll be controlling every aspect of food production. There is also skepticism about whether the government can effectively manage the registration process and use the data in a meaningful way. Some small-scale bird keepers worry that the registration system will create unnecessary red tape and bureaucracy, adding stress and confusion to what should be a simple and natural practice. Many fear that the system will ultimately fail to improve biosecurity measures, but will instead burden farmers and hobbyists with paperwork and potential inspections. Sustainable livers argue that policies like the poultry registration law are particularly harmful to those trying to live in harmony with nature. The small-scale organic farming practices that many off-grid and sustainable livers adhere to often result in healthier animals and a lower risk of disease transmission, thanks to free-range methods, natural diets, and more attentive care of individual birds. These individuals believe that their environmentally conscious methods should exempt them from the same rules applied to large-scale commercial operations, which can have higher disease risks due to the crowded and controlled conditions under which poultry is kept. For many, keeping chickens and other birds is a crucial part of creating a closed-loop system in which animals and plants benefit from one another. Poultry provides manure, which can be composted to enrich soil, and in return, birds are fed scraps from vegetable gardens. These integrated systems allow for greater food security, reduce waste, and minimize dependence on industrial agriculture. Sustainable bird keepers argue that government interference could disrupt this delicate balance. Moreover, some within the community see this law as part of a broader pattern of policy decisions that favor industrialized farming and large-scale operations over small, local, and sustainable agriculture. They feel that instead of supporting people who are trying to reduce their environmental footprint, the government is imposing blanket regulations that undermine self-reliance. While the intent of the law is to protect public health by improving the government's ability to manage avian diseases, the backlash from those living sustainably raises important questions about how to balance national biosecurity with personal freedoms. Supporters of sustainable living argue that small-scale bird keepers who use traditional and organic farming methods should not be subjected to the same regulations as industrial farms, which have far higher risks of disease outbreaks. The government, on the other hand, maintains that avian diseases do not discriminate based on the size of a flock or the method of farming, and that comprehensive registration is necessary to ensure a coordinated and effective response in the event of an outbreak. They argue that failing to regulate small flocks could leave dangerous gaps in the country's biosecurity measures, especially as bird flu and other diseases continue to pose threats to both animal and human health. As mentioned, many of the individuals who are protesting the new UK law requiring the registration of poultry and captive birds see it as part of a larger government agenda to control food production. This belief, prevalent among sustainable livers, homesteaders, and small-scale farmers, stems from a growing suspicion that government policies are increasingly designed to centralize food systems, leaving little room for individual autonomy or alternative small-scale farming practices. For those who choose to raise their own food, whether it be poultry, livestock, or crops, this legislation represents yet another attempt to regulate, monitor, and ultimately control how food is produced and distributed. At the heart of these concerns is the belief that the government, through regulations like the poultry registration law, is systematically working to assert control over food production by marginalizing small independent producers. The industrialization of agriculture has already created a system where large corporations dominate food production, from factory farming to commercial seed distribution. Many in the sustainable living community argue that these corporations work hand in hand with the government to create policies that make it harder for small-scale farmers and hobbyists to maintain their independence. These individuals fear that by forcing all bird keepers to register, the government is slowly creating a system where small-scale, sustainable food producers will face increasing scrutiny and regulation. They argue that once the government has a detailed registry of who is keeping birds and where, it could lead to more stringent regulations that disproportionately affect small producers. For example, future laws could mandate how birds must be kept, what they are fed, or what medical interventions are required, regardless of whether a person has 2 chickens or 2,000. This fear is compounded by the belief that the government, through these regulations, is slowly making it impossible for people to raise their own food without bureaucratic interference. Many individuals who live sustainably have expressed concerns that the government's ultimate goal is to consolidate food production into the hands of a few large corporations, making independent food production increasingly difficult. By doing so, they argue, the government and big agricultural businesses can exert control over what people eat, how it is produced, and at what cost. This shift would undermine self-sufficiency and the local food movements that many see as vital to reducing environmental impact and promoting healthier, more ethical farming practices. The poultry registration law has reignited debates about food sovereignty, the right of individuals and communities to control the production, distribution, and consumption of their food. For many sustainable livers, being able to raise their own food, including poultry, is a crucial aspect of food sovereignty. They value the independence that comes with growing their own vegetables, raising chickens for eggs, and avoiding the industrial food system that they see as harmful to both the environment and public health. With the introduction of this new law, many feel that their food sovereignty is under threat. Registration requirements, they argue, open the door for further restrictions that could eventually make it difficult, if not impossible, for small-scale producers to continue raising their own food. The fear is that by registering their birds, they are giving the government the power to regulate their personal food production practices in ways that could undermine their autonomy. Future regulations could include mandatory vaccinations, regular inspections, or limits on the number of birds one is allowed to keep, all of which would disproportionately affect small-scale, independent food producers. For those living sustainably, the ability to control how they feed themselves and their families is not just about practical food production, it's about the values they hold. Many choose to raise their own poultry or grow their own food as a way to opt out of an industrialized system that they view as environmentally destructive, unsustainable, and unhealthy. They take pride in knowing exactly where their food comes from and in the ethical treatment of their animals. To them, government regulation in this space feels like a threat to these deeply held values and an attempt to bring them back into a system they have intentionally chosen to leave behind. Many who oppose the poultry registration law believe that it is not just about biosecurity, but part of a broader agenda to centralize food production and place it under the control of large agribusiness corporations. They point to the ever-growing influence of companies that dominate the global food supply chain, from seed and pesticide manufacturers to large-scale meat processors. These corporations have historically benefited from government policies that prioritize efficiency and mass production over small, sustainable operations. Critics of the law argue that the government, under pressure from these powerful corporations, is gradually introducing measures that make it harder for small, local farmers to compete. The poultry registration law, while framed as a biosecurity measure, is viewed by some as the beginning of a slippery slope toward more draconian controls that could ultimately benefit large producers at the expense of independent small-scale ones. By tightening regulations on small bird keepers, critics argue, the government is nudging people away from self-sufficiency and toward reliance on corporate food production. This concern is particularly acute in the context of ongoing discussions about food security, sustainability, and climate change. As governments and corporations push for more controlled, centralized food systems in response to environmental challenges, many sustainable livers worry that their small-scale efforts to produce food in environmentally responsible ways will be marginalized or even outlawed. The emphasis on efficiency and large-scale production in industrial agriculture is often seen as incompatible with the slow, organic, and regenerative practices that sustainable livers value. For many individuals protesting the poultry registration law, their resistance is rooted in a broader distrust of government intentions. They feel that governments are increasingly encroaching on personal freedoms and that laws like these represent a form of creeping control over private life.